Hi everyone, Goblin Squire here again, and today I'm going to talk to you about gluing your miniatures and gluing them onto bases and things of that nature. So I'm going to talk to you a little bit about the different glues which I use and which I would recommend that you use, but also a little bit about the best way to go about it so that you get the best results to ensure that you get through it first time and you don't have any breakages, things like that. So first of all, I'm going to talk you through some tips before we get to the actual gluing, and then we'll look at the glues themselves. So my first tip, and I really can't encourage you enough to do this, is to give the miniatures a dry run before you actually glue them together. And what I mean by this really is just to test without any glue to make sure that it fits together properly. So to make sure that you've taken enough of the flashing and the mould lines off so that it fits together, so that you know where it's going, you know which way round it goes. Really just make absolutely sure you know what the miniature is going to be once you do it. That way you don't end up putting glue into something and finding that actually it doesn't quite go where you meant it to, or it needs to go a different way round. You don't end up with glue going everywhere, hopefully. It really means that by the time you start gluing, you're absolutely on top of what the plan is and where things need to go. And it just cuts down on the hassle and the stress of trying to figure it out while glue is drying, while all that's going on. So just take a few moments to check that stuff out. With Reaper miniatures, like I've got here, it's actually not very difficult because you can see that there is a sort of socket that those things go into. But with some of the other things, it's not quite so simple. I'll show you a Mantic miniature in a minute, and that doesn't quite have the same thing. So just make absolutely sure that you know what's going on before you get the glue anywhere near your miniature. This second tip is particularly useful if you're trying to glue things together quite quickly and get through a volume. And it's really to think about the order that you're putting things together in to make sure that you're not putting pressure on joints that you've recently glued. So here I have a Mantic miniature, and you'll see me gluing this in the inset video, which will run in a minute. But you might notice on that one of the first things that I do is stick the spear into the hand. These come as separate pieces and the arm comes separate from the body. And the reason that I did that is because if you glue the arm onto the body first and then come to glue the spear to the hand, if you haven't given it a long time to dry, that can easily then just pull that hand off. Now you can see it's quite strong. That's not going to cause me too many issues. But if you want to do it at speed, and you'll see how quickly one of these can go together in just a minute, but if you want to do that, you want to get the order right, so you're putting as little stress as possible on things that you've already glued. Often that is a case of attaching weapons to arms or shields to arms or things of that nature, but just plan it ahead and think about the order that you want to do these things in. Okay, so now I'm going to run you through quickly the different glues that I use and what I use them for and what I would recommend for you, but I'll say as I go through what's necessary and maybe what's a bit more of a luxury. But the first one to point you towards, probably unsurprisingly, is superglue. Superglue is a big one to use. I've got two types here. I would use these for the majority of my miniatures, certainly metal miniatures and the Reaper miniatures. I'll come on to another glue in a minute that I use for other plastic miniatures. But these are great. The reason I have two is this is my favourite type of superglue. You realise you're deep into this when you have a favourite type of superglue. But this is my favourite for two reasons. One is this Power Flex thing here. That means it's actually got some additives to the superglue. I think it talks about it being rubberized, but I don't know if that's a technical term or if that's just what they use to describe it. But it means that it just has a little bit of give to it. One of the issues with superglue, great though it is for holding, is that it can be a bit brittle. So it doesn't allow much movement, where a lot of miniatures have a little bit of movement in them just to prevent breakage. Superglue doesn't really have that, but this stuff does. And the other reason that I really like it is because it's not a liquid, it's actually a gel. So it's very easy to control. You just put a tiny blob on the area that you want to do, and then stick it on. That really helps to avoid, firstly, that horrible look of super glue all over the miniature because it just fell all over the place and rolled down, but also helps to prevent the sticking of fingers to miniatures. I mean, let's be honest, that's going to happen inevitably at some point, but this does help with that. It is very slightly more than your basic super glue, which is why I do have two, but it's not a lot more. I think I pay about 50p more for this than I would for the absolute basic kind. This is the very basic. This is the cheapest super glue I could find at the time. The reason I have a mini version of it is simply that that was on sale, or the cheapest at the time. And the reason I have this is because, much as I love this type of super glue, when you're attaching a miniature to the base, you don't need it to be nearly as controlled. You don't necessarily need that lack of brittleness either. So just get the absolute cheapest super glue you can find and chuck it on with that. So this is great for that. And so I would use super glue for sticking together most of my miniatures and for attaching them to the base. So that's what I would use these two for. The other glue that I mentioned before is this. It's a plastic glue, plastic cement. That's what it used to be called. I don't know if it's still called that. Anyway, so I use this for the Games Workshop miniatures, for Mantic miniatures, things like that. Some of that harder plastic miniatures. You absolutely can use super glue. Super glue, as I mentioned, has that kind of brittleness to it, and I find that this kind of glue is slightly better for really allowing the miniature to have that slight flexibility that just stops it breaking very easily. So this is a little bit of a luxury, I guess, when you could just use super glue, but actually it's not much more expensive than super glue. It's very much in that same price range. So if you are gluing a lot of those hard plastic miniatures together, I would recommend getting this. And that's what I've used in the indented video that you'll see. So I think these are the main glues that I would go to. All of them, particularly Games Workshop, I'm sure there are others, do their own versions of these. But glue is one of those things that you really can pay far more than you need to just for going for a branded version. So you can get Games Workshop plastic glue, but that's essentially what this is. And I think you can even get Games Workshop super glue, but I don't see them as being any better than this. This one I definitely bought on Amazon. I think I bought this from my local hobby shop, but there's no difference in quality as far as I can tell. The only other glue that I'm going to talk to you about very quickly is this wood adhesive. I've got such a big bottle of it, it doesn't even really fit on my phone screen here, which is what I'm recording with. So this is, it's described here as wood adhesive. It's also called wood glue in some cases, but it's basically PVA glue. And it says here for all woods, but actually it's a great glue for attaching things to the base other than the miniature. So things like flock. I've got a miniature here. So that flock that I've attached there, I have done with PVA glue. Again, you can pay a lot for PVA glue from model shops. This cost me, I think, about £3 from a DIY shop, and it's got vast amounts in there. And actually, I rarely use it in in that state anyway. I have a very professional looking little tub here, and what that is PVA glue mixed with water. So I water it down, and then it's having trouble focusing because it's translucent. But what I do is I water it down, and then that makes it flow much better over the miniatures. So when you're doing something thin like this, it means that you get much better coverage with it a little bit watered down. If you're looking to attach a few larger things, then you absolutely use it in its unwatered down state. But that's the same wood glue I bought when I started painting miniatures. And that's lasted me such a long time. So it's definitely worth spending a few pounds. This I think was cheaper than a very small bottle the size of the super glue from a model shop. So go for that. Experiment with it, see how much you need to water it down. This is also useful for mixing with snow flock if you're creating a snowy effect, which I'll talk about in a later video. But those really are the different types of glue. and we've talked about some of the hints and tips about how best to glue your miniatures together. As ever, if you have any questions, do let me know either on Twitter or Patreon. I'll be back next week. Maybe not next week because of Christmas. I'll be back soon with a video on priming and my suggestions on how to do that and which primers to use. But in the meantime, happy painting, and I'd love to see the results of what you're doing on any medium where you can find me. But happy painting.